Afternoon, folks. Welcome back to the Food for the Faithful channel with me, Bill Reimer, your reluctant prophet. Today we're going to discuss identity politics, anti-Semitism, and woke. There are two basic worldviews which will determine your political temperament. The first view subscribes to the blank slate theory that we are born innocent with a highly malleable nature. You may hear folks who subscribe to this theory state things such as prejudices are learned and not inherent to the human condition. In order to shape social development, they assume that it is necessary for the state to socially engineer society to guide the process of properly socializing humanity. These are the social collectivists who believe that it is necessary for the government to play a strong role in managing this process. Those who hold to this ideology define this process as progressive, since the process of cultural evolution is ongoing. Therefore, they view the entire project as continuous and unending. Or, to describe this ideologically in plain language, the communist revolution. The second and more traditional view is a belief that mankind is inherently flawed and sinful. Therefore, the process of perfecting one's character must be an intensely personal and spiritual endeavor. Very often, this view also holds that this process can best proceed when the individual seeks divine help in their ontological journey. Those who hold these views, these ideas, are cognizant of the fact that the world is a battleground between good and evil. They also recognize that mankind will always fall short of moral perfection due to our flawed nature. Essentially, the first category externalizes the path to perfection, which is why they so often blame others for their moral failings and believe themselves to be victims, while the latter understands that they are most often the authors of their own shortcomings, missteps, and sufferings. The first category will divide mankind into identity groups, who are assigned guilt and/or innocence based purely upon their collective identity, while the latter category judges people not by these immutable characteristics, but by their individual pursuit of morality. This month has offered repeated proof that once again, social collectivism invariably leads to identity politics, tribalism, and murder. As I mentioned, those who label themselves as progressives claim to believe that prejudice is a learned behavior. If that were true, what then can possibly explain the hideous escalation of anti-Semitism just this past month alone in the wake of the atrocities committed by Hamas against Israel? Is it not the left who mysteriously labels anyone with an opinion they do not like as a Nazi, even as they persecute Jews just like the Nazis? The left's attachment to immutable traits in order to assign innocence and guilt has reawakened the basest tribal instincts of mankind among those who incredibly deny that such instincts exist. I am aware many of you will have heard of the kerfuffle with Buffy St. Marie as to whether she is indeed indigenous. I've also read the comments of many of her fans in the roots music scene here in Canada who came to her defense. Two things I find remarkable about this. Firstly, regarding what causes her to view her ethnic identity as the most paramount and important aspect of who she is. If I was to do something similar, you would be likely to read of me constantly harping on about my ancestry. Let me be clear. My ancestry is of almost no interest to any of you, and neither should it be. Why is it then, as soon as one identifies as a member of an ostensibly oppressed minority, that this becomes the most important thing that ought to be used to judge that person, to determine the value of their character or of their importance as a musical artist. Secondly, I read of her using the phrase, my truth. How on earth could her truth be different from anyone else's truth, since if it is true, then it is equally true to everyone, not merely personal to her? In her own words, I know who I am. Buffy St. Marie calls indigenous identity questions hurtful. To those who question my truth, I say with love, I know who I am. Clearly, she assigns herself moral virtue based purely upon external characteristics that she, indeed no one, has any control over. This externalizing of the truth to the collective unconscious is a telling characteristic of the radical left. Since their worldview does not align itself with reality, it therefore becomes necessary for them to create a simulacrum of reality, which then becomes their truth. This is where Hegelian dialectical analysis comes in and is employed. And I suggest, if you are not familiar with that you watch one of my previous podcasts where I investigate how the dialectic operates. Obviously, this process requires considerable faith to believe in something that does not exist, since it cannot exist. These are nothing other than the delusional fantasies of weak minds who cannot handle living in reality. Furthermore, this detachment from reality causes them to seek out people who will share in their delusions, which is how the zeitgeist of ideological possession is spread. Or, as evolutionary psychologist and university professor Dr. Gad Saad puts it, idea pathogens to parasitize the mind. In the words of Dr. Gad Saad, I was born in Lebanon, Beirut, Lebanon. We were part of the last group of Lebanese Jews who had steadfastly refused to leave Lebanon. But when the Lebanese Civil War broke out in 1975, the Lebanese Civil War is a standard by which all butchery is measured against. It became impossible to remain in Lebanon. So, we were there for the first year of the Civil War, and then luckily, we were able to escape to Canada. The most direct way it shapes my work is that it allowed me to see what happens to a society that is insubstantiating a perfect ethos of identity politics. In Lebanon, everything is defined by identity politics. In this case, it was your religious heritage. There's an internal card in Lebanon, which basically is like an internal passport that states very prominently your religion. And if you were Jewish, they didn't even write Jewish. They wrote Israelite. So it even created greater animus against you, even though you've got nothing to do with Israel and you're Lebanese. So I saw what identity politics does to a society. And to see it lauded as a wonderful way to organize society 45 years after I left Lebanon is quite disheartening. There's a debate now about who is allowed to speak about what. Your background allows you in a way to speak out to our current movement. But do you agree with the idea that you need to have experienced something in order to have an opinion on it? No. People can analyze the Holocaust even though they didn't go through it. Oncologists study cancer even though they never suffered from it. On some matters, of course, your lived experience adds one data point to the total narrative. I think in my case, the fact that I do hold the highest hand in victimology poker or the gold medal in oppression Olympics makes it more difficult for the enemies of reason to use the woke calculus against me. And so I use that against them in a somewhat sardonic way, but in a very effective way. because they don't actually listen to the veracity of your arguments. Instead, whoever has the greater victimhood wins. And the reality is it's going to be very tough for most people to defeat me. And so they end up losing against their own grotesque calculus. And so in that case, I am pleased to have my lived experience because it allows me to defeat the idiots. End of quote from Dr. Gad Saad. Yes, the world is a battleground between good and evil. That battle is essentially ideological, since the war is being fought on the academic front and has spread from the lecture halls into society writ large. Hence back to my first assertion that this category believe the state's gig is to control the project of socially engineering society. So from the academy, the most insidious doctrines of the species of social collectivism known as woke is returning us to tribalism. From the National Post, dated October the 16th this year, entitled Canada's New Anti-Semitism Envoy Eyes the Cancerous Hate Speech on Campuses and Social Media. From the article, working with communities across Canada, we must and will promote and support extensive efforts on anti-Semitism education. And yes, we will visit the universities. I provide the link to the article so that you can read it for yourself. Lyons was named to the role Monday morning during a conference on anti-Semitism in Ottawa. She told reporters that her appointment comes amid the malignancy growing here, that cancerous hate speech, that desire to polarize and divide and disrupt and destroy the spirit that is Canada. End of quote from that article. So, my summating thoughts. To those of you who are foolish enough and or sufficiently ignorant of the history of social collectivist movements, our universities are responsible for this incredible return to all the brutish tribalism inherent to those two great ideological genera of social collectivism known as Nazism and communism. If the two were to fornicate to bear a bastard child, then surely woke is their offspring. Every social collectivist movement of the past resulted in murder, tyranny, economic ruin, and social disaster. They were based upon the idolatrous belief that God is dead and that the state therefore must engineer the perfection of humanity. And they did so by murdering Jews, while assigning guilt and or innocence purely based upon the immutable characteristics of the identity group to which each of us belongs. I am constantly astounded at how unaware people are of their own moral failings, which is required from them to externalize their own foolish pride and sin. And there is nothing more prideful than to assume we are born in a state of innocence. Obviously, a newborn baby has not yet sinned, but this is in no way negates the fact that sin lives in that baby, just waiting to manifest itself. To my own shame, I fully acknowledge my own sins, which are so glaring and abundantly obvious that I would need to be unconscious not to be fully cognizant of the fact that I am a miserable sinner whose only hope is in the unmerited grace of God in Christ Jesus. So let us examine what the scriptures tell us about our redemptive identity if we choose to come to Christ, who is the way, the truth, and the life. From Galatians chapter 3, verses 26 to 29, for in Christ you are all children of God through faith. As many of you as were baptized into Christ have clothed yourself with Christ. There is no longer Jew or Greek. There is no longer slave or free. There is no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ. And if you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. End of quote from Galatians. Make Christ your identity, for he has nullified all else when you are united with him in salvation. These are things to think and pray about on this Sunday, October the 29th. God bless you. Have a lovely afternoon.